Hello, everybody. This is Lisa Johnson from Everbridge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our webinar topic is active shooter preparedness for hospitals. We're giving an update for 2017, and our speaker today is Steve Crimando. We're going to review just a few things, a few logistics, an introduction for Steve, and then he will take over and talk about the updated IAHSS statistics, the complexities of an active shooter in a healthcare setting, planning, training, and exercising, managing the incident life cycle, updating the run, hide, fight training for your facility, rapid notification considerations, and then we'll have a robust audience Q&A. We do ask that you follow us on Twitter at EB Healthcare, where we give regular updates on emergency management for hospitals. With that, I'd like to introduce Steve. He is an internationally known consultant and educator, specializing in the application of the behavioral sciences in homeland and private security, violence prevention, crisis management, and disaster response. He is a certified trauma specialist, a certified police instructor, and holds level 5 certification in homeland security. He is frequently called upon by law enforcement agencies, the media, and the courts to provide insight on workplace, school, and community violence prevention. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for taking your time out of the day to join us. As Lisa said, we're going to talk about some updated information, but I want to be upfront with folks and tell you that this is not necessarily an active shooter 101 level course. We're going to be making some assumptions that you and your organization, and I know we probably have representatives of many different sorts of hospital and healthcare organizations, and perhaps even others beyond that on our call today. So in that way, we're going to understand that the material I share with you does have to be modified to your unique settings and your unique demands, but it's at a fairly high level and is really intended in part to mature your existing violence prevention and active shooter plans. So we're going to jump right into that. And Lisa did a pretty good review of our table of contents, so I'm going to move right past that and kind of get right to our meat and potatoes, as it were. I think most of us would agree at this point that when we think about an active shooter or we hear about a shooting event, perhaps on the news, we're no longer shocked by it. We're probably still saddened by it, hopefully not at this point desensitized by these events. But what we've learned over time, of course, is that there's not a particular geography or sort of organization that's immune from mass violence or from an active shooter situation. Therefore, in all of our different industries, all our different settings, there's a real push for us to be in a state of readiness. And part of that readiness really comes out of the reality that these events are very, very quickly or rapidly evolving. Most active shooter scenarios, we're told by the current FBI statistics, were about 5 minutes or less. That's about 70% of them in which they were able to ascertain a timeline. So what we're doing in those first few moments of an active shooter event is absolutely critical to safety and survival. And we have this term we refer to, and you may use this as well, of the response gap. The response gap is quite simply the time between that first shot being fired and the first incoming law enforcement. And the situation changes radically. Regardless of our environment, it changes radically as soon as that first law enforcement person tends to get on site, and the shooter transitions from being the hunter to the hunted. Many of those cases, you know, end in suicide of the shooter and other sorts of outcomes. But this is a very unique sort of event, a very unique sort of crime in which there's this assumption that bystander intervention, and I don't mean just casual bystanders, but all of us in the environment who may be there at the time of the shooting, can and should play a really, really important and significant role in responding to the event. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go. Lisa mentioned that we're going to talk about some of our most recent statistics. And going back just about a year, what we saw was that while there was a drop in crime in general in the community, there was a drop in crime in various different sorts of crimes in hospital. Rates of violence, especially rates of violence against staff, are almost at record highs right now. And shooting is part of that mix. And the reason I bring this up early is a recommendation I make often to organizations I work with, is that your existing workplace violence program. And I'm going to talk to you more fully about what we mean by that in just a moment. Should not be a standalone from your active shooter plans. And very often, I work with different organizations. They might say, oh, we have a great active shooter plan, and somehow that's their workplace violence prevention program or policy. The active shooter situation represents, of course, the most drastic and devastating manifestation of workplace violence, but it's also statistically rare. And what is much more common are other sorts of violence, and we want you to be prepared for both of those, very rare sorts of violent events and the everyday or much more common violent events. We do a better job in safety and security and defensibility of our decisions and our plans. Now, I bring this up early on regarding OSHA. Most people know that OSHA does not have a workplace violence regulation per se yet, but we've been hearing since about December that there's a real push in the organization. And this is a little bit subject to the current administration and different political forces, but very much a very strong new force in OSHA pushing for what may be the first actual workplace violence regulation or law. And it will be focused, it looks like, on healthcare and human services. And that's where a lot of the action is statistically in workplace violence. In fact, we're going to mention this later, that healthcare and human service workers are actually more than 4 times likely to be assaulted and victims of violence than any other kind of employee in the United States. So we're actually kind of at the cusp of potentially having our first workplace violence regulations, or OSHA in much more concrete terms, speaking to us about, a regulation. Now, since September 2011, OSHA has actually substantially stepped up its investigation, citations, and fines around workplace violence issues, and the majority of those are also in healthcare and human service organizations. Many of those cases are also in home-based healthcare and home-based and community-based services, and we'll touch on that as well. So compared to community violence, which is dropping, we do see some changes in what workplace violence looks like in hospitals and healthcare settings. And that's important to us because we actually do not do well in our plans, our policies, our procedures, or our exercises. I'd like you to think about almost everything I share with you today is also have a value in how you think about and design your exercises, and make sure that they are based around what we call accurate behavioral assumptions. And what I mean in that way is that how active shooter events look, how they unfold in hospitals is considerably different than what they look like in schools and campuses and movie theaters, houses of worship, shopping malls, things of that nature. And we really want to advocate or stress the importance of planning for the thing that's most likely to happen. And that does not necessarily mirror what happens in active shooter events really across the country. So it's important for us to stay up on these cases. If we go back just a few months to Georgia, Dublin, Georgia, an incident of a sheriff's officer shot himself when responding to a call of an active shooter at the hospital there. That turned out again to be a different kind of event. I want you to watch these stories because they tend to be more representative of what shooting events look like in hospitals compared to what shooting events look like in those other settings I mentioned, shopping malls, movie theaters, houses of worship, and the like. A case just several weeks ago, excuse the typo there, March of 2017 in Melbourne, Florida. Here, this is an interesting case, and it's something we have seen in a number of other hospitals as well, where the person is brought in the hospital as a patient, admitted perhaps even to the hospital, and maybe their belongings were not thoroughly screened. This is a hospital that actually had installed metal detectors and was taking workplace violence and shooting risks very, very seriously. But yet this patient was able to go into her belongings overnight, retrieve a gun that she had brought into the hospital, and use that gun in a shooting. And then you may remember the case that was originally called as an active shooter case. A lot of law enforcement storming into the vicinity. This was a big breaking news story in January of an active shooter situation in Texas. And it was an individual who became irate because he was told he had to wait for a period of time, didn't want to necessarily take off his clothes for examination or x-rays, walks out of the environment, and then again, having access to a weapon, starts to shoot or pulls the gun at least, and then is shot by a security officer there. Now, as I said, the significant part of all of these cases, and you could go back over the last several years, is that when we think about an active shooter case, by definition, we're talking about someone who's looking for a target-rich environment. They're really looking for numbers. And there's usually not much of a relationship between the shooter and the victims. The victims are most often randomly selected. Now, I'm not suggesting that those things don't or can't happen in hospitals, but the nature of shooting events in hospitals tends so far not to be that person who's just walking in looking for a mass casualty event. It tends to be much more targeted. So when we think about our plans or policies or training for staff and also our exercises, it is important to be kind of vigilant of the cases that are going around the country, cases that are happening around the world, because they really should speak to us about our reality. You know, what do active shooter cases look like in hospitals? Now, as I said, any shooting incident, whether it's a mass casualty event or it's much more of a confined or contained shooting event, is a nightmare type situation. I mean, we're talking about vulnerable people, patients. Sometimes we can't move or evacuate quickly. There's just so many challenges when a shooting happens within the hospital setting. And yes, hospitals are soft targets. You know, they tend to be pretty porous and lots of different places that people can come and go from, depending on their level of security. Guests, visitors, vendors, patients, all kinds of folks are flowing in and out, and they can be those target-rich environments where there are access or is access to a lot of potential victims as well. But as I said, we know from cases, and we also know from some of our guidances, that we need to be prepared for the shooting incident that's targeted much more than probably, or equally as we're planned for a large-scale mass shooting event. And I want to suggest two levels of guidances for you if you're not familiar. Remember also, I don't know if Lisa mentioned this, that the recording today is archived. You can go back to this. You can receive these slides. So some of the material I have in here as resources, you will be able to access after today as well. The two primary documents about active shooter events in general that I recommend are the most current FBI study. It spans 2000 to 2013, and a project I worked peripherally on with NYPD, then Police Commissioner Kelly, the active shooter recommendations and analysis for risk mitigation. Both are very thorough. Both are very up to date. The FBI study is just a little bit more current, but a lot of the findings are very similar. Those should be on your desk. You know, those should be part of your bookshelf back in your facility. But just alongside them, there are some really, really useful hospital-specific and healthcare-specific guidances. And the first of these is actually from Homeland Security, and a part of OSHA playing a role in this as well. And you see the title here, Active Shooter Planning and Response in Healthcare Settings. And the second one is Incorporating Active Shooter Incident Planning into Healthcare Facility EOPs, or Emergency Operation Plans. That's from the FBI, from FEMA, and from Health and Human Services. There are lots of very, very useful parts of both of those documents, including some guidance on developing exercises. So again, if those are not already on your bookshelf, they are great sources of information for you. Now, let's just be clear, as I said, as we think about evolving and maturing our plans, an active shooter, by definition, is that person who's honestly trying to shoot fish in a barrel. They found a place in which there's a lot of people, the shooting's in progress, it's confined, it's a populated space, and as I said, the person is going for numbers. A classic example of this, although it's not a hospital situation, is our shooter in Aurora, Colorado, in the movie theater. If you just think about people lined up, sitting in those rows facing the screen, not being able to see the shooter, but the shooter can clearly see them, how they're lit from the screen, and really just looking for numbers. When we think about this, it is a premeditated, cold-blooded event. There's a long planning curve. We know a bit about shooters of this type. in which there's a long period of preparation, and the shooter tends to be very methodical, very prepared, very focused on the event. A shooting incident is something different. It tends to be much more targeted. It tends to be much more confined. There's lots of different scenarios that meet this criteria. It's a gunfight, maybe with, we think about a gang member who's brought to our hospital, accidental discharge of a weapon, a shot fired, a lot of different scenarios we'll touch base on. But these tend to be more reactive. It's someone who's acting out of an impulse, an angry response of retaliation, and it tends to be really focused on the people or person who they believe hurt them. And when we think about hospitals and such, it is folks who are looking for a doctor, a nurse, a medical professional, a team, or a unit perhaps that they feel has wronged them or their family. When we think about shooters in hospitals, again, we have a different distribution. In general, if we look at the NYPD study, it's 96% male. In hospitals, it tends to be 91% male. I mean, we have slightly more female shooters in a hospital setting than the general public. And the larger number of these come out of, as I said, revenge. Someone feels that they were hurt or their family's been hurt. Suicide plays a significant role in the statistics. We've had cases like that recently in hospitals. And one that's very interesting you should be aware of is the mercy killing of the person who brings a weapon to the hospital. And this often ends as a murder, suicide, shoots and kills a terminally ill loved one in a way of putting them out of their suffering, shoots and kills themselves. And then we have other scenarios as well, such as the escaped prisoner, either in the forensic unit or more likely in the emergency department. But what you need to understand about these is most of these incidents had only one victim. They're shots fired, it's the shooting event, but it is not a mass casualty event. Can it potentially evolve into a mass casualty event? Well, sure, it can, but the motive tends to be different here, and the relationship to the victims tend to be different here as well, as you can say. When we think about this, there are a significant number of innocent victims, folks who are randomly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this is a little bit different. If you look at this graphic, this is from the NYPD study, you see nearly a quarter of the victims in a typical active shooter event are random victims. They just were wrong place, wrong time. But when we think about the hospital environment and healthcare settings, most shooting events have a specific, or the shooter has a specific target in mind. Many of these arise out of a domestic violence. What we're going to talk about in a few moments is type 4 workplace violence, in which it is a current or former domestic partner, and they know where to find them, during their work hours. There are current and former employees represented in about a quarter of the case. And then you also have current and former employees. So we have the whole mix here. But when we think about the hospital shooting, one thing I'd like you to take away from this early part of the program is it is much less likely to be random victim selection and someone just cutting loose with the idea of having a mass casualty type shooting. Active shooter events in other sort of scenarios, other venues, are more likely to meet that kind of characteristic. Now where we have a slight crossover, though, is in those events that are directed towards the hospital for terrorist motives. These have not been as common in the United States just yet. When we look worldwide, we've seen over the last decade or so about 100 terrorist attacks directed at hospitals for a terrorist motive. And the motives are mixed. Some of it is because the hospital is part of critical infrastructure, because of the symbolism, because it's a target-rich environment. There's a lot of different motives that we know of. But in this way, we understand that terrorism directed towards the hospital is part of the mix, but is not as likely as the other categories we've touched about. So where we'd like to come down, just kind of closing out this first introductory section, is that the characteristics of active shooter incidents in hospitals, they're actually very, very different than other active shooter events that we sometimes see on the news or happen in other settings. And you have to be operating on accurate assumptions for your environment. And you can't necessarily generalize that active shooter events that happen in these other places will be the type of event that happens in your hospital and healthcare. And the other thing that we're leading to is that there are some very unique characteristics about your environment when you think about planning and exercising. There may be special patient areas. Those could be forensic sort of units in which we're bringing prisoners in or out. Emergency departments are often the recipients of folks being escorted in, sometimes in handcuffs, shackles, and otherwise by armed officers. There's a number of potential problems that arise out of that. There are potentially high-profile patients or VIPs, and sometimes those folks come with their own security details. That's a challenge. Your behavioral health units, in which we may have individuals with various and sometimes severe mental health conditions that can be associated with other sorts of risks of violence as well. But I've highlighted here, when we think of all the places that have special considerations, and this list is not exhaustive. I mean, it really depends on your facility and what you have going on. A lot of our units and programs within hospital and healthcare have their own very, very unique risks. And what this suggests to you is you cannot necessarily do this one large sweeping workplace violence and active shooter prevention and response plan for your whole facility that is kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, because some of your units are going to have very, very unique demands and very unique characteristics that you need to adapt to. So you really have to drill down and think about, in these different units, what are going to be some of the very unique challenges and how do we work around those? This title, not my title, but from an article done in Emergency Medicine News back in February, and here the citation is for you to find as well, to go back and find this article. The title of the article was simply, Are our emergency departments the most dangerous workplaces in America? And the answer is, yeah, they are some ways the most dangerous. In fact, one study of nurses suggested that 100% of the nurses in the survey group had histories of being assaulted by patients. So there's a lot of dynamics in the emergency department about how we run our departments, the nature of patients coming through, the nature of, as I said, sometimes forensic patients, that raises the risk. But when we look at workplace violence statistics and workplace assaults in the hospital, about 75% of those are directed towards emergency department staff. So that's obviously a very high-risk environment. And what you're doing in that environment in terms of preparedness, response, and exercising will probably look different than what you're doing in other parts of your hospital. One I use often is just such a glaring sort of case example is in your MRI suite. And obviously the MRI is just a giant, incredibly powerful magnet. And there have been instances around the country of police officers responding to crises inside MRI suites, whether they're freestanding off-site or they're in the hospital, and having their weapon, their firearms, ripped from their hand, perhaps ripped from a holster. And there's been at least one instance in which that handgun slams into the MRI machine and discharges, and a shot's fired. So we have to think about, in each unit, what are those unique hazards to our patients, to our staff, to the responders, and how do we make sure we're exercising appropriately and planning really appropriately to that environment? One of the places I want to touch on as an update is really this growing trend for mobile workers in general in the United States, worldwide as well. But the largest segment of mobile workers right now is in the healthcare and human service sector. And we're putting more and more people into home health environments, into community-based healthcare, and obviously there's a lot of different risks there as well. These should be incorporated in your workplace violence and, believe it or not, in your active shooter plans as well, because we want to make sure that your employees who are working out in field settings, they're equally as vulnerable, and we're equally as liable or have the higher sort of liability to protecting those folks, at least the same degree of liability as every other employee we have. From OSHA's perspective, the term workplace is synonymous with being on the job and being at work. Wherever it is you're doing your job, we need to be thinking about worker safety. So what worker safety looks like and even active shooter safety looks like. For the mobile employee, it is going to be different than what you're doing. But the point here really is made by the title, that those workers who are off your campus, who are in the community, they cannot be out of mind in any way. We owe them at least, if not more, the same levels of protection and training in terms of violence prevention, including risk of shooters, as we do to employees who are working on site. So when we do this, we apply this concept of work area evaluation, regardless of where the worker does their job, if it's on site, if it's a freestanding clinic, if it's in community or home-based healthcare. All of that needs to be swept up in our violence prevention and active shooter sorts of approaches. Now, one thing you may have noticed already is I'm using those terms, workplace violence and active shooter, not necessarily interchangeably, but I have them attached together. Because, as I said, the active shooter incident represents kind of the sharpest point of the spear, as it were. It's the most dangerous and devastating sort of event, but it's part of a larger continuum of workplace violence that we need to be considering and thinking of. And while active shooter events are very dramatic, they're very newsworthy, we're very sensitized to them, we need to be in a more holistic way preparing for all kinds of violence in our hospital and healthcare settings, with workplace shootings and active shooting events being just one type. So when we think about that, we really want to consider the active shooter as part of a larger continuum of violence, and we want to make sure we're preparing ourselves across the whole continuum. So I'm going to touch base on the 4 standard types of workplace violence that OSHA considers very quickly. You will probably have no trouble thinking of scenarios for your healthcare and hospital facility. Type 1 is actually the most common. It accounts for about 85% of workplace homicides in the U.S., and in this instance, it's with criminal intent, and what we mean by that is we have no relationship with the offender. They have picked your facility because they believe there's something of value, pharmacy, it's access to high-end equipment, whatever it is, it has probably some sort of value for them in a robbery. And if a deadly weapon is used, people can and do get hurt, people can and do get killed in those environments. Most often we think of that as happening in the convenience store, the gas station, the liquor store, someplace late at night all alone with cash on hand. But there are many instances in hospital and healthcare environments, especially with medications on site, in which we also see these sort of robberies. Type 2, this is where the action is statistically in hospitals and healthcare. It is violence that's initiated by someone we know as a patient or a client, including current and former patients and clients, because we can have a former patient or their family members who have some kind of chip on their shoulder about their perception of how we cared or perhaps didn't care for their loved ones. As I mentioned before, hospital and healthcare workers are the disproportionate statistical representation in our level of assault there, and this is really part of what we need to focus on. When most people think about workplace violence, the thing that comes to mind most often for them is coworker to coworker or coworker to supervisor violence. That represents about 7% of workplace homicides. It's one that's actually in some ways most predictable and most preventable, because we know or have known the person pretty well as a coworker, and we're very often seeing them almost every day. And those crises tend to be more of a smoldering crisis. It happens slowly over time as anger and resentment builds between people. But as I said, not only is it coworker to coworker, it's also coworker to supervisor when the person feels that their manager or supervisor is to blame for their misery or had some responsibility to perhaps step in and intervene in a difficult situation and failed them in some way. And that now classic disgruntled worker feels somehow that their supervisor is culpable or has some burden of blame in this as well. And the last of OSHA's classic types is type 4, which is domestic violence or intimate violence, intimate partner violence that follows someone from home to work. Now, hospitals and healthcare organizations could also be slightly disproportionate in this sort of risk if they have a larger female workforce, because typically in this sort of scenario, the offender is male, the victim is female, and the greatest period of risk is when that woman tries to separate from this abusive or hostile man, and he doesn't know where she's gone. She may be staying with friends or family or a shelter, something of this nature, but he does know where to find her from 9 to 5 or whatever her shift is. And a lot of the violence we have seen in hospitals, both in parking lots, and we have to extend our thinking beyond just the physical building to our perimeter and to our parking areas, are people intercepted on their way to work, perhaps from their vehicle or from mass transit to the hospital or healthcare facility by an estranged, angry, and disgruntled sort of partner. But in our current environment, what we found is it's also important to build upon OSHA's 4 existing types of violence, and we add into our mix now ideological violence, and that's violence that is directed against your organization because of what you do or what you represent. And the photograph here kind of really says it all. This was a shooting from the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs in November 2015. The first day of his arraignment in court, the shooter stands up and almost proudly says, "I'm a warrior for the babies." So he's speaking to us about this strong, philosophical or ideological or religiously driven sort of motive. The operative word here, the one I've bolded on the slide, is the person is an extremist. And they feel that whatever they're doing, that the small harm they're doing may be justified and necessary to prevent a larger harm that your organization does in their mind. So this could be a group rather than just an individual. But there are many instances, again, especially when we start to think about the terrorist risk we face across the country and around the world today, where type 5 violence should be viewed as the intersection of workplace violence and terrorism. It's when terrorism kind of comes to work. And another good example of this is when we think about the shooting in San Bernardino, California at the Public Health Department's meeting and holiday party off-site, and people clearly can think back to that. When we bring in this 5th type of workplace violence, it actually starts to build a little more of a bridge between the classic workplace violence scenarios and the active shooter risk, because we're talking about a different sort of violence in which there may be multiple offenders, more sophisticated weapons, and a more sort of organized attack in our facility, as opposed to just what we normally see as the lone actor. And most hospital shootings have been lone actors. And as I said, they're people we've known as patients and clients, people who have some sort of grudge, and they're seeking out specific targets, not just large numbers of casualties. Now, the other update to really think about for 2017 is we've started to see a movement beyond simply run, hide, fight. One of the places this comes from, I'll speak to, was just about a year ago, coming up on June, the anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. And we've expanded our model now to go kind of think more holistically along the life cycle of the active shooter event, the before, the during, the after. And where our focus was nationally, really, as we came to grips with all the shootings we had through the mid and late 2000s into the early 2010s, was that these happened very quickly, and we needed to be some level of preparation because there would be no time to think about what to do. And we got very busy with the national model of run, hide, fight. And there's variants of this like ALICE or ALERT, other models for preparing our employees to respond to a shooter. But our attention was on those moments of terror. And as I said, what we know now is most of these events, first shot fired to shooter down, we're talking about 5 minutes or less. There is a lot going on pre-event, there's a lot going on during the event, and there's a lot going on after the event that we need to really be prepared for and think through. And this is where the expanded models are coming from. Bystander intervention before, during, and after are critical, and they should be factored in. This means that our employees and folks who may find themselves in the shooting environment really have to have the right mindset, the right skills, and access to the right resources if we are collectively going to do this, do this well and survive these kind of events. So what this graphic is saying to us is, in the old school, and this is literally cut and pasted out of the old Homeland Security materials, the message was run if you can, hide if you can't, and fight if you must. But fight should always be the last resort. And if you think to Orlando, you have one shooter in a nightclub with 300 guests, 300 patrons. And he opens fire, and what do people do? Well, they ran, and that's appropriate. They ran and hid, and they hid in the restrooms, and the shooter follows them in, and we end up with essentially a massacre. People in crisis conditions do not rise to the occasion. They fall to their training. And if we have trained people that fight is only a last resort, we actually may deprive people who are up close and arm's length from the shooter, in which running is not a great option and hiding is not a great option, but fighting might be their very best first option if they are in a certain situation. So we want you to think about, what is the message you're giving to your employees about run, hide, fight? Is it that these need to be linear and sequential? You always try to run first. If you can't do that, you hide, and only in the last, as a last-ditch attempt, do you fight the shooter? Or in this new paradigm, is it you need to use your judgment in the moment? And depending on your proximity to the shooter and other factors, including just your temperament and your mindset, going hands-on with the shooter might be your best first resort, your very best first option. So what you've seen in the updated models is actually kind of an uncoupling, or at least taking these three options. We still think they're the correct options, but taking them out of that linear and sequential way of teaching people, in that in some instances we may be leading them to slaughter. We may be actually pushing them towards a place where they're trapped and unable to fight back. Now, this is interesting material, and it goes back to a researcher, very, very well-known and respected researcher, Blair, in Texas, and his team who have studied kind of active shooter incidents in incredible depth. But one place where they've had a lot of attention is bystander intervention. If you look at this graphic with me, to the right of the screen, actually to the left, let's start there, you have the before the police arrive. And the line right up the middle, the vertical line, is when the police arrive. This is 83 cases. You have 40 that end before the police arrive. You have 42 that end after the police arrive. And in the red box, what I've suggested or pointed out is that in 16 of the 40 before police arrive, that's about 40%, the attack was stopped by bystanders. Bystanders can and do play a critical role. And you may be thinking to yourself, how do we fight against someone who's armed and they're in this, combative mode? How do we do that? And we know people do, and they do best when we have prepared them. I want to talk to you about how we prepare them in just a moment. But there's another place for bystanders. In fact, there's two other places we think bystander intervention is critical. And that is in the immediate response to the victims. Because one of the things you may know is police are trained, as they're coming into the situation, they're not going to stop and help the wounded. They're going to go towards the shooter, towards the sound of those shots, and their primary task is to neutralize and stop the shooter. And then we'll double back and deal with this. Now, there are some new models we call rescue task force, in which we may have more EMS personnel operating in the warm zone, going hands-on with victims sooner than we ever had before, because we know most people who die in active shooter events, they die by bleeding out, and they die by bleeding out within the first few moments of being shot. So if our responders, initially police, are rushing into the situation, but they're not going to stop and care for the wounded, who will? If you've designed safe rooms, or you've designated shelter rooms or safe harbors in your facility, I got to tell you, there's probably nothing more traumatic to your workforce than watching a coworker bleed out when they feel they have nothing, perhaps, that they could do. Now, I know in your hospital and healthcare setting, you're going to have a lot of clinical staff that do have the skills and do have the knowledge. But you also have administrative areas. You have a lot of other areas where people are not necessarily going to be skilled, hands-on medical professionals. So we really want to level that playing field. And one of the ways we're doing this nationally, if you're not familiar, is the Stop the Bleed campaign. And this is a page right out of Homeland Security's website. If you simply go to dhs.gov, use their search engine to type in Stop the Bleed, you'll see some good video, you'll see some handouts, you'll see all kinds of material in which we're really trying to push civilian awareness and civilian knowledge that all of us should know, how to apply pressure, how to use gauze, how to stop the bleed. Police are going to be busy. The police are going to take a while to sweep and clear the environment. They're looking for potentially additional shooters. improvised explosives, all kinds of other hazards, they're not going to be able to go hands-on with the wounded very quickly. Somebody should. Somebody should. So when we think about the new generation, we're moving from simply stopping the killing, and that's the run, hide, fight, or any version of that in which you're trying to get people out of harm's way or neutralize the shooter. Then we talk, let me go back one slide, to stopping the dying. And stopping the dying is about bleeding control, BCON. And we're going to look at different models for that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But we also go back then lastly to managing the initial psychological trauma in the moment of people who are just blown away, freaked out by what they're seeing unfold in front of them. That's what we refer to as stopping the crying. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting in any way these are not incredibly powerful, traumatic, tragic events in which people should justifiably, be upset and cry. I'm talking about someone who is so emotionally distraught in the moment that they're becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I would venture to say that many, if not most of you on this call right now, have seen the active shooter video that's known as Run, Hide, Fight, produced by the Houston Mayor's Office with Homeland Security funding. You could find that easily on YouTube just by simply typing in Run, Hide, Fight. There's one scene in the video that very often when we show this in training, people kind of snicker at, and it's this woman here in the snapshot in the red sweater. She's in a break room. Her coworkers are getting organized to take on the shooter. They've barricaded the doors, and they've committed themselves to, if this guy comes through the door, we're going to take him down. And this woman's in the corner, and she's having a meltdown. What do we do with her? She's giving away our position to the shooter by being loud, by crying, by being hysterical. She is part of the problem and not part of the solution. Psychological first aid is a specific skill set intended to decrease fear, arousal, anxiety, and the potential for more harmful behavior. It is meant for the 0 to 48 hours of the traumatic event. 0 hour, now, while the event is happening. And in academic circles, for example, the National Biodefense Board had said several years ago, we think there should be as many people in your organization trained in psychological first aid as are trained in CPR. This is a necessary skill set in managing and responding to an active shooter event. You have to remember that we may be, co-workers, workers in your environment. They could be locked in shelter rooms. They could be hiding for literally hours before police find them and clear the environment. You're going to need a way to manage the psychological reaction as well as the medical impact. Medical impact, that's bleeding control. The psychological piece is equally important. I just want to make a clear distinction before I move away from psychological first aid and start to talk a little bit about communications. And that is to say that there is also a model of training that is out there referred to as mental health first aid. It is very good training, but it is different, and it is not psychological first aid training. In mental health first aid training, which still may be useful for your workforce, people learn about the major categories of mental illnesses, such as mood disorders, thought disorders, anxiety disorders, and so forth. Learn about the symptoms of those disorders, learn how to intervene and assist someone with those signs and symptoms, and connect them to the right resources. But the assumption is, in mental health first aid, that the person we're assisting has or is developing a diagnosable mental health condition. That is not psychological first aid. Psychological first aid casts a much wider net, and it's for everyone having that powerful shock and awe sort of response, traumatic stress response to the violent event in the moment. There's no assumption that this is any indication that the person has or is developing a mental illness. In fact, very often you hear the expression, these are normal people having normal reactions to abnormal events. The fact that we're locked in the supply closet, hearing shots fired outside the door, and someone is freaked out by this, that's pretty understandable, right? That's pretty normal reaction. That's where psychological first aid can be helpful. So as you continue to build out your level of readiness, different organizations are looking at different assets. We've seen some move to putting out deployable throw kits and trauma kits in which it may be a little pack that's tucked in your AED case on the wall, or it may be a freestanding kit on the wall. has tourniquet, has combat gauze, has what we call basic bleeding control supplies. Vendors in the marketplace have gotten very creative. They're thinking about ways to put different assets with those, sometimes pepper gel to defend against the shooter. Some of these kits are so bright that they talk to you just like an AED speaks to you and gives you audio prompts so you can guide you through how you apply a tourniquet, things of this nature. So we continue to see this innovation and this creativity in how we address the risk, but we also have to think about how you address the emotional component. And part of what guides that emotional component is really how we communicate. And simply no better way to save lives compared to anything else I've shared with you than removing the potential targets from the attacker. And that's good crisis notifications. It's emergency alerts and notifications in which you can clearly tell people what's the problem, where it's happening, what to do. So we know these events happen so fast that you need to have your technologies, your templates about your messaging up to speed, ready to go, because there will be no time for getting yourself organized when that first shot is fired. You need to think about your templates and your messaging and making sure that staff are aware how to use those and how we'll communicate. We know, again, that this will save lives, and being in this level of preparedness actually increases your defensibility. One point I want to make along the kind of psychological or behavioral dynamics of this is to make sure you're using plain language in your messaging. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are making these recommendations now as well. What we understand is if we're calling a code, code silver or something to that effect, your staff may know what that is. Guests and visitors and vendors and others may not, and that is not particularly helpful to them. Guess what? The shooter, he knows he's in the building. He knows he's shooting. We're not tricking anybody by using the codes. So the message today really is that we should be speaking in plain language in all of our communications, that your notification tools need to be primed and ready to hit that button and blast out that notification. And essentially just 3 key or 4 points. What is happening, where it's happening, what they should do. Should they evacuate? Should they hide and shelter in place? And how will they receive further information about what to do next, such as all clear? You also might remember that there's a long tail on these events, and you may need to be communicating with people for days and weeks after the shooting event, and keeping those same conduits, those same emergency communications technologies and channels open will be really, really helpful. So my message in closing and passing it back to Lisa is understand that shooting events in hospitals and healthcare settings, they look very different than shootings in other environments. And that some of the units and programs and departments in your hospital are going to have some very, very unique requirements that you need to think through, so you can't do anything that's a one-size-fits-all. We also know that as we've seen more shootings, we understand that there's clearly this potential intersection of that type 5 terrorist scenario, whether it's 1 or 2 shooters or more. And because of the evolution of the risk, we see the evolution of the response now has moved simply from run, hide, fight to stop the killing, stop the dying, and stop the crying. And that includes having readiness for bleeding control and psychological first aid. Lisa, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm going to pass the baton back to you for some discussion and then maybe some questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate that. That was, as usual, a fantastic presentation. A couple of people actually reached out to me specifically to say you did amazing and they have takeaways that they can use immediately. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. As you know, Everbridge is the #1 emergency communication platform in hospitals in the United States. We have over 1,000 hospitals now. In fact, we cover 23% of all hospital beds in the United States. So we've been growing steadily, and that is because we have a rock-solid system that works no matter what. One of the big things that works so well for us is templates. When you have so little time to execute, having a template in place that you can just send out and have people start reacting to can really make a difference in lives saved. When it comes to active shooter, we do send over 30 million messages per weekend, and we can handle over 600,000 messages a minute. So if there is something horrible going down, you don't have to worry about, when your message is going to get through. It's going to get through immediately. As I talked about, we did use templates And what I did want to mention is I know a lot of you are addressing the CMS categories right now. While active shooter isn't in one of those CMS categories, you do need to look at specific incidents that could happen at your facility. So having some active shooter templates in place could be something that the surveyors, as they're coming through, will really appreciate. And I think that's going to be about it. I'm going to move on to our first question. We have a lot, so let me get going here. The first one I had came in before the webinar, and a couple people also asked it. Do you recommend any equipment such as panic buttons or metal detectors or anything like that for healthcare facilities?
For healthcare facilities, the answer is yes, and a little bit of a wishy-washy answer is it depends. You need to think about those technologies as being kind of a little bit surgical. You know, there are places that will benefit by those, and they make good sense, and there's some places where they don't do an awful lot of good. But the other thing is really the application of it. I can't tell you all how many facilities I've been to, and when we do a site assessment or audit the place, they'll say, well, we have a panic button. I'll say, that's great. Tell me, when you hit the panic button, what happens? And the answer is, I don't know. We've never done it. So when you think about the technologies, they should not be seen as the solution. You need to really think 2 or 3 steps beyond that and say, and then what happens? Who's watching? You know, who's on the receiving end of that panic button? Is it the local police? Is it our security department? What do we expect in terms of response? So I do recommend, depending on the setting, I can't say this universally, that there are very, very good and sensible applications of those sorts of technologies, but they need to be thought through well. And I would suggest before you do it, you work with some sort of security professionals, both in-house and external, who are very, very familiar with these and can give you some guidance. Anybody credible and ethical is not going to just outright say, oh, sure, if you need a magnetometer or metal detector, we got it, we'll sell it to you. You want to think very carefully about where you're putting it, the sort of effect it has on you know, your environment and your culture. And if you think about things like panic buttons, they can make a big difference if they're used right. So the answer is yes, but you need to be very thoughtful about where they go and how they're used.
Thank you very much. We have a question that I've actually never seen before, so I'm curious about your answer. Once the police arrive, how long does it take to clear a hospital from an active shooter incident where they're kind of back to running normal?
Okay. Now, I'll start with the general statement of it all depends, right? It depends on the severity of the shooting, where it happens, and all kinds of things will vary. I'm going to speak in generalizations. If we make an assumption, let's by default talk about the shooting as happening in like one contained area of the hospital. It's a lobby, it was emergency department, something like that. Once the shooter is neutralized, first of all, you have to assume that the shooter gets this. They know that as soon as they pop off that first round, the police are on the way. Someone's on the way, and this is going to end quickly. And it ends, as we said, in a number of different ways. Once it ends, the police are going to continue the search as if there are other potential shooters until they have cleared the entire facility. That means checking and looking everywhere. They're also going to be looking external. Is there an improvised explosive device, not just in the building, but in your parking lot, in a vehicle in the parking lot? So the search itself is going to be exhaustive. This does not necessarily mean closing. It doesn't necessarily mean evacuating places that may be difficult to evacuate. There's a lot of considerations about that. But the police procedure of this is going to be very, very thorough and very slow. I think that it is a reasonable assumption that if it has been an active shooter event where you have one or more people shot or killed, that unit will be offline at least a day or more. It's an active crime scene. It's going to take a lot to kind of put it back together. And one thing I recommend is it shouldn't be your janitorial or housekeeping staff that's putting it back together. Use crime scene cleanup companies, use disaster restoration companies that have the right training and personnel, and you don't want this to visually be traumatizing and haunting your staff who are patching up bullet holes, cleaning up blood and body fluids and, putting the place back together. So obviously there's a lot of variables that will determine, really the severity of the shooting, its human impact, doing something in terms of counseling or EAP support for employees and others who have been exposed to this. There are so many moving pieces in the recovery. In fact, I believe, at some future point we're discussing doing, some sort of webinars just on the post-shooting environment because it is so complex. If I had to summarize, and really I will for the sake of time, the affected areas of the hospital will probably be offline for days. I'd say a minimum 1 to 2 days, and it can be longer depending on the event and everything around that. You need to then think about the criticality of that department, wherever this happens. Is that department a department you could live without for a few days? Or what's your workaround? What's your contingency plans for operating if that department's offline? But there's an awful lot to that. You're right, Lisa. It's a really, really good question, but it's also a question that would almost take another webinar to thoroughly unpack because there's so many moving parts to the answer.
Yeah, it actually kind of leads into one of the other questions, which I think is perhaps a follow-up webinar worthy. So the other question that we have kind of around that is, do you have suggestions for an active drill for active shooter?
Well, I have a lot to say on that topic again. The thing I would say to you is work up to the drill. You should start with things like tabletops and discussion-based exercises where you're bringing in all the key partners you would need from your local law enforcement, EMS community, all the other players you would need, internal and external, to do this well. And then I would build upon this and do it in a segmented way. And what I mean by a segmented way is not to do it hospital-wide, really to think about which departments may be more vulnerable, which programs, plan for it accordingly, do it thoughtfully. And the guidance is, those 2 booklets I mentioned early on, Lisa, that the people have asked for the links to, actually have some templates and guidance on how to conduct those exercises. But part of what I think is most important to say in exercising is people very often say to me, Steve, we want to do an active shooter exercise. People are asking, or we have a requirement perhaps to do that. So we're doing active shooter. Before you write the scenario, you need to identify your exercise objectives. What are the things you are testing? Because you have to remember, the point of any exercise is not to test people, it's to test your plan. So one might be our ability to communicate with the workforce, with employees, with everyone in the shooting environment, to quickly notify them and start them moving towards safety. One objective might be our liaison with incoming responders and working with an incident command structure. There's lots of worthy sorts of objectives, but you want to start by nailing down something doable, like 3 or 4 objectives, and then building the story, the active shooter story around there. Where it happens, what part of the hospital, how many victims you have, and then the assumptions. Think about the exercise injects. What are all the little curveballs about, how many people were hurt and what it's going to take to recover. So there's tremendous value to exercising, but you do need to think about doing it in a very structured way, and I wouldn't rush to a drill. I would start it at lower levels of exercise, as I said, discussion-based and tabletop sort of exercises, and gradually work your way towards a functional drill where you actually have people and equipment moving. That in the hospital requires an awful lot of planning because you're taking people and you're taking a department perhaps offline for a short period of time while you're doing a functional drill. So those are just some things to think about. The most important, though, is to think about objectives before you write your scenario. And again, to make sure that those objectives line up well with the reality of those unique departments that you're testing.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up for the day. Steve, we look forward to working with you again soon. We had over 300 people on the webinar today. Thank you all for coming. and look for an email by Friday with all of the resources from today's webinar. Thank you very much.